Hello, everybody. Today, our speaker, an important speaker, is Paolo Gerbaudo. Paolo Gerbaudo is a Marie Curie Fellow at Scuola Normale Superiore and reader in digital politics at King's College, London. And Paolo is the author of some important books, such as The Digital Party and The Great Recoil. Thank you very much for joining us, Paolo.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
The title of the lecture is The Indian Citizen from Digital Activism to Populism. The stage is yours, then we will open the floor for question and answer.
Perfect. Yes, I've changed slightly the title. I hope that's okay. So as I was thinking, working on other issues recently, that really it is decisive time for debates on digital democracy, as it is an issue that for some time has been mobilized by different actors and has been the object of contestation, and it has gone through different evolutions. And perhaps so my purpose here, given the general topic of this summer school, was precisely to give a sense of how the debate on digital democracy has evolved through time and where that may be heading, right? And how that also connects indeed with notions of populism, notions of citizenship, and how all in all, it is a sort of decisive point of contention between different ideas of what the internet should be and of what democracy should be in the present year. Yeah. So I'll start, basically, I'll take you along a path going from utopia to ideology to reality, as you were, I mean, following a bit kind of like a Marxist or Karl Mannheim's category in a way. So going in a way from a very lofty, a very elevated kind of discourse, which I think was the original discourse of digital democracy, down to a more, in a way, partisan and factional discourse of digital democracy as the one that was more characteristic to the kind of second phase of digital democracy, as digital democracy was developed by a number of political parties and groups. And finally, to kind of reality, which is, for me, in a way, both the vulgarization, we may say, and the generalization of digital democracy in our everyday experience and in the digital platforms, in the social media platforms that we use every day, which, as I shall argue, is a form of kind of everyday or every second digital democracy, where we are constantly, informally and unconsciously voting on all numbers of issues, but doing so in non-dedicated platforms, and doing so in a way on platforms that are obviously private and ever more controlled, actually, by oligarchs, such as Elon Musk, now trying to control Twitter, for example, for reasons that, in fact, as I shall conclude, have very much to do with the fact that these are the platforms where really existing digital democracy happens these days. So let me start. So let's start from Utopia. So for people like me who have been following these debates for some time, say from the 90s, really, I was lucky enough already during my early studies to get direct experience of the early internet in the late 90s and of the early forums, bulletin board systems, chats, and so on and so forth. You could already see back then how there was this discourse of digital democracy, which was very much connected with the experience of these online communities, right? Of these internet communities, as they were described back then, that were emerging at the time. You had a number of platforms, besides kind of bulletin board systems. You had Usenets, you had mailing lists, you had all kinds of new technologies that were used by groups of people, usually relatively small groups of people, like few tens of people, few hundreds of people, that would at the time have this euphoric experience in a way of experimenting this new form of sociality where you could interact at a distance from other people, yet feel in a way an almost kind of tangible sense, right, of social relationships being established, but also of various forms of social organization being established, like sympathy, antipathy, cohesion versus fragmentation, hierarchies, charisma, right? All the typical, in a way, it was a bit of a kind of sociological lab happening in real time. Especially in communities that were a very, how you say, kind of uniform in their social composition. Scientists, for example, like physics researchers or science researchers more broadly, artists, political activists, journalists, programmers, coders, who were in fact the pioneers of the internet, right? And who would populate these different communities, often communities that were quite specific and defined around one of these different categories. So the discourse of digital democracy also had to do with online communities such as the Well, like where you had online forum systems that were very much kind of trying to recreate the atmosphere of a small town, where you would have kind of elders, right? Where you would even have kind of names for figures that had a social role in introducing people to the community, giving you a welcome. And the idea was very much, to use actually a term that now Elon Musk has used in reference to Twitter, the idea of recreating a town square. And since we are all kind of like from the Mediterranean, from around the Mediterranean, I mean, let's think about a kind of small town, the typical kind of Mediterranean small town of 6,000, 10,000 people, which has its central square, right, where people gather, people chat, gossips go around, rumors, people complain about problems with the local government, right? Shopkeepers complain about too many taxes for their shops. Like, I mean, the typical things that in a way are, how would you say, like the very basic texture of politics at the most granular level. Right? And in a way, this was really the exciting thing about these experiments, ultimately, these social experiments, like recreating social communities from a distance, and very much around going back to kind of Tönnies' famous opposition between community and society, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, something that in a way resembled much more Gemeinschaft, community, rather than Gesellschaft, like society. Namely, a human grouping that was supposed to be quite cohesive, quite uniform, quite homogeneous, and in which people would be strongly integrated, right, in that grouping, right? They would feel a strong sense of belonging, and in turn, they would also have quite a qualified intervention on that very community. Namely, not just the ability to vote on things or to aggregate their preferences numerically, quantitatively, but to actually be heard, to say their ideas, to express their feelings, as you would do on an internet forum such as the Well. So that was a bit this imaginary of the early internet, an imaginary that also discursively is quite interesting, the kind of references that were used. There were references back to New England town halls, for example, you know, the US traditions of town hall meetings in the New England region, like the early colonies of the United States, where still to this day, right, you have these basically full assemblies of the citizenry, as the ones you see in The Simpsons, right, or other similar cartoons, where people gather all together and they discuss things, right? And it is a kind of an assembly democracy in a way, not that dissimilar from the one that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was discussing, the social contract, and where basically, at least in theory, say, everyone has the right to intervene, has the right to express him or herself, and contribute to the life of the community, to the decisions of the community. Other references that were often mobilized in the discourse were ancient Athens, obviously. I mean, that is the kind of constantly recurring idea. Again, an idea of assembly democracy, despite all the limits of that assembly democracy, the exclusion of slaves, the exclusion of women, right? But the idea was there again of, in a way, moving away from representative democracy, being dissatisfied with the mediation of representative democracy as a democracy reduced to the act of casting a ballot once every 4 or 5 years. And instead the desire to reclaim some degree of direct participation, some degree of what in Italy in social movements you would call presa di parola, like taking the word, reclaiming your word, your expression. Really, I mean, this idea of self-expression, the desire to, I want to express myself without mediations, without somebody doing the job for me, which in fact was not something that was invented by the utopian pioneers of digital democracy. Was something that was quite a long-standing theme across many so-called new social movements of the post-1968 era, where there was very much at the center this leitmotif of allowing people to express themselves, allowing individuals to be heard, to self-determine, to decide on themselves, on their body, and so on and so forth. So the idea there, the idea of digital democracy that you had at the outset also had quite a distinctive libertarian feel to it, right? In a sense of a political culture being suspicious of authority, of hierarchy, and desiring to reclaim individual liberty and self-determination as a means to recuperate ultimately freedom and a sense of authenticity in human relationships. You had people underpinning these both on the kind of more political end and on the technological end. On the technological end, people like Ted Nelson, one of these kind of techno-utopians, emerging at the crossroad really between academia, industry, and new age cultures almost, that wrote at length on this idea of reconstituted, reorganizing society around more horizontal and more flexible mechanisms. So this is the first part of the story that I gave you to date, to this point, and is a story that, as I said, is quite lofty, is quite utopian in its character, and was, as all discourses and all stories, it was very grounded in the type of social community or social grouping that it sprouted from, which in that case was, as I said, made of small groups, or organizing online, being quite small, being quite homogeneous, right? Being actually also quite over-educated, often with an income above average, very young people, mostly located in the West Coast, initially of the US, and in kind of highly industrialized and technologically advanced areas of the US and Europe. And now we move to the second chapter, which is a bit less lofty. So it goes down kind of 2 registers, say, in terms of its idealism, right? And moving progressively to the realism that we will fall into in the final stage, like the final kind of stage of inferno, as it were, to use a Dantesque metaphor. So what I want to discuss in this chapter instead is the discourse of digital democracy that you find within a number of formations of political parties seen in recent years, such as the Pirate Party in Scandinavian countries, Movimento 5 Stelle in Italy, and Podemos in Spain. So what these parties have done, I think, has been really significant in the sense that they've been perhaps the most important place where digital democracy has become something more consequential and something more tangible, something not limited either to blueprints or to declarations of how things should be, nor to small practices contained within quite insular and numerically limited communities, but practices that instead operate on a fairly large scale that involve tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people in what is sometimes described as kind of mass online interaction. And finally, practices that have consequences, hence why it's consequential, namely that carry implications for the political direction of a party, decisions about the leadership, policies being decided, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So obviously, this is not the only real or concrete application of digital democracy that has developed in the course of the 2010s. You've seen majorities, for example, using digital democracy platforms, Barcelona, Paris, Reykjavik, and many others, for example, having forums where citizens can make proposals, or even the European Union, like sometimes kind of using some very basic forms of online consultation. But my argument is that in no place, these forms of digital democracy have received so much attention. And secondly, the reason why they have received so much attention was tied to the fact that indeed they had a weight in the actual power balance, in the actual power process within these parties. So what these parties that in my work I describe as digital parties fundamentally have done has been to establish some platforms that are variously described as decision-making platforms, as participatory platforms, and with many other kind of synonyms. And what these platforms are very kind of, simply speaking, are sections of these parties' websites where people can do a number of things. They can register. They can participate in consultations. They can participate in discussions of various kinds, as you would do on any forum or on any social media platform, like writing a post or writing a comment, intervening in the discussion. They can vote, both in the form of kind of representative elections, like selecting one among the different candidates that are running for a given post, both internally for parties' internal posts and externally for people who are want to run as candidates of the party in elections. They can vote in referendums, right, which in fact is the most important digital democracy institution that these parties have developed. And they can do further things, such as giving money, right, which is perhaps the most important one. It's quite an overlooked form of participating in politics, but our colleagues in the US know all too well that actually money makes politics, and that it is also a very important form of political participation. And finally, they can, for example, attend training sessions, right, if they want, for example, to become elected representatives and they want to do politics, for example, at the local level as councillors, and so on and so forth. So these are some screenshots of what these online decision-making platforms look like. Initially, Podemos used a section of Reddit. It then went on to develop a system that is similar to Reddit, though more sophisticated, with threaded discussion, where you can upvote and downvote which itself, if you think about it, is a mechanism of digital democracy, right? Where you don't only can vote for someone, but can also vote against something, right? And then there's all sorts of questions about how you weigh these different votes, how that should reflect in terms of the visibility of a content, right? And how sophisticated the threading of a discussion should be, right? Whether it should be just kind of one linear discussion, or whether it should go in many directions, and ultimately how people can make sense of the emerging consensus, so to speak, that is coming out of such chaotic discussion, which in fact is often the problem of online discussions from point of view of digital democracy, from the standpoint of both activists and coders, namely the tendency towards the centrifugal tendencies, as it were, of online discussions, right? The fact that the things often tend to go in so many ways that it becomes very difficult to understand what the community has agreed, if anything, which reminds me a bit of left political meetings in Italy, where you'd have no agenda usually, right? And everyone speaks, everyone says something, and ultimately nobody can figure out at the end what has been decided. Everyone has expressed him or herself, but then it's not clear what the collective has decided. Yeah, there is a sort of trade-off, indeed, I'd say, between self-expression, individual self-expression, and actual kind of collective decision-making. So this is another screenshot of one of these platforms from Podemos, where they were voting on different documents. But here I'm running to the last slide for this chapter, which concerns the actual results of these consultations. So this slide is taken from my book, The Digital Party. And this graph is about Podemos and the internal referendum conducted by Podemos between 2014 and 2018. Podemos has 500,000 people registered to its online platform, right? So it is a significant number of people. I think still now is at least on paper or on digital paper, it is the largest Spanish party, even bigger than the PSOE, the Socialist PSOE, which I think is a bit less, around kind of 450,000. And what you see there is the percentage that went to the winning option in each of the internal referendums conducted by the party. So these were kind of binary choices, yes or no. And these is how many votes went to the option that ended up voting. Yeah. So what you see there is, I guess, pretty easy to guess, right? I mean, except for one case, all percentages are above 80%, right? Which means that it is not a very normal distribution, as it were. It is an abnormal distribution, in the sense that you have the winning option won overwhelmingly, right, over the losing option, which is, in fact, the contrary of what you see in real democracy or in electoral democracy, where almost invariably the competition comes very, very close. I mean, think about whatever the Brexit referendum, 52 to 48%. Think about whatever recent French elections. Right? I mean, not that close, but still, you see, like we are used to elections, especially referendums, being quite close competitions, where the two options are not that far away, perhaps 10 percentage points max. While what you see here is that in most cases, there was an overwhelming decision in favor of one of the options, which is not really a symptom of pluralist democracy, right? Because in a pluralist democracy, what you would expect is some degree of uncertainty as a positive thing, some unexpectedness, namely a situation in which things are not decided at the outset, but you are not really sure what may come out of that. which is in a way both the thrill in both a negative and positive sense of democracy, right? Whenever there is a democratic event, people are either hopeful or scared because they are not really 100% sure what may come out of it. Yeah. What in this case instead corresponds to what in Italy we call Bulgarian percentages, right? It is a journalistic expression that refers back to the constitutional referendum in Bulgaria, I think in 1978, if my mind doesn't fail me, which was won with an overwhelming percentage, as many kind of sham elections in the Soviet bloc back then, like 98.9%, right, of people voted in favor of a constitutional change. So what you can see in these elections, so this applies to Podemos, but very similar is the case of the Five-Star Movement, is that the promise of digital democracy in practice is contradicted by a situation where you have a show election, right, which doesn't really have the fundamental condition of a real election, of a real referendum, namely the unexpectedness and uncertainty of that, the risk for the leadership of engaging in that. To the contrary, often these referendums are called precisely by the leadership as a means to reinforce, to reassert its power. For example, when faced with a negative press campaign against them, or when confronted with some internal dissent within the party. So at those times when they feel that they need to re-legitimize themselves, to show that the base, the supporters are still with them. Yeah. The case with Podemos, with the Five-Star Movement is quite similar. In fact, with the Five-Star Movement, you have two cases of rebellions of the membership base, both in 2014, when the leadership had not yet come to an understanding of how to avoid these rebellions of users, when they were still a bit too open for their own organizational interest. In one case, it was about, and these were two very interesting cases, in fact, because they showed positively also the potential that some forms of digital democracy may have in ensuring a real pluralism within political parties. The first case was around the debate on migration and the crime of illegal immigration, which was basically criminalized through a very ugly law by the right in years before. So it had to do with the fact that the base of supporters of the Five-Star Movement back then was still quite leftist. And therefore, many users were rumoring to get this law eliminated. And so as to pacify this debate, ultimately a referendum was conceded. And the leaders, the charismatic leaders, because they had no formal role back then, Beppe Grillo and Casaleggio, made very clear to members that they didn't want this referendum to be passed, this internal referendum to be passed, because they were concerned that this would alienate the right-wing electorate that they wanted to win over. But the base basically didn't take account of that, and they voted 60%, if I remember correctly, in favor of the Five-Star Movement taking a position to eliminate this law, right? Making Grillo and Casaleggio very angry after that, basically saying that the users, the members of the party, users/members more properly, were taking a decision that was dangerous for the party's performance and credibility and so on and so forth. So this is interesting because I think it gives you a sense of what can be the spaces for actual democracy within such formations. And they are precisely in the fissures, as it were, of kind of organization and decision making. So the moments where things don't go according to plans, right? While in fact, in the great majority of cases, things go very much according to plans. And referendums have these quite double-faced character and quite manipulatory character, because on the one hand, they are seen as the voice of the people, vox populi, right? Which in a very condensed and simplified way tells you what the majority wants. On the other hand, though, as Robert Michels, the political sociologist who wrote the very famous book on political parties in 1915, before becoming a fan of Mussolini, though at the time it was still saying things that they were very, very lucid and very, very thoughtful. But what he said back then was that referendums depended very much on the question that you would use for the referendum. Right? It's like saying, do you want vanilla or chocolate, right? Say, when you, for example, are interacting with a child and you want to move a child towards a certain decision. Sometimes even the order of the options that you're giving influences the audience. I mean, usually people go for the first option. Actually, there've been sometimes with the first movement where things got really surreal, where they were basically refashioning questions so that in order to make yes the answer, they would turn the question in a negative form, which wouldn't make any sense. Yeah. And Michels was also referring to the actual use made by Napoleon III of referendums, right, as a way to manipulate public opinion, right, and to, in a way, manufacture an idea of popular support for decisions when actually that popular support was not forthcoming. And we also know that, in fact, also Mussolini himself and Hitler would use kind of referendums, or would see referendums as a viable institution in order to reinforce that power. So this is not the entire history of referendums at all. I mean, referendums have both internally within organizations and nationally also a very important democratic history to them, right? In Italy, the institution of the referendum has been used to achieve important civil rights, victories, divorce, abortion, so on and so forth. And within and you think about it, organizations are constantly doing internal referendums. Think about a trade union when they are calling a strike, right? And they are basically asking their members to vote yes or no. That is nothing more than a referendum, right? But that is to say that while they look like a direct democracy institution, and in digital democracy they are often presented as such, one also needs to guard against the way in which sometimes these online referendums are actually quite manipulative in the way in which they are presented, in which they are kind of delivered. So here I come to the last chapter of this slow descent in the inferno of digital democracy, and this is reality. So which is what I think digital democracy is becoming now. It's just one needs to distinguish between two types of digital democracy. One is a digital democracy happening on dedicated platforms and be conducted explicitly, where people are told that they are entering a decision-making process, that they need to speak, that they need to make up their mind, and they need to literally kind of cast a ballot, though a digital one. And this is the first type. The second type being instead what we could call digital democracy writ large, namely all those practices where people are doing democracy, doing digital democracy, expressing their opinion, casting a ballot without being consciously or explicitly doing that, which is basically what we are doing constantly every day on social media platforms through the most important function or feature of social media platforms, which is reactions. So when we are thinking about social media platforms for a long time, we've been told that their distinctive element was their multimedia character, right? The fact that they could integrate different media within them, audio, video, visual, text, and then interactive, hyperlink, and so on and so forth. And the interactivity was a kind of second feature. If you look at kind of early theorists of new media, such as Bolter, such as Manovich, these were the features that they would indicate. And interactivity being actually quite a major idea there. But actually, if you think about it, more than interactivity, the mass internet we know now, the kind of vulgarized internet we know now, is more about reactivity, is more about reactions. So 95% of the things you do online are not action, but they are reaction. They're not about creating new content. They're not about expressing yourself, but they are about reacting or not reacting, which is in a way also reaction to other contents that you see posted by other people. Such as when you browse through your timeline, through your newsfeed, right? And you look at people posting and you basically decide, all right, I'm going to give a thumb to this person, like, or wow, this is a friend of mine, I'm gonna give him, her a love, or this is funny, haha, or this is not funny, but this person is ridiculous and what you're saying is ridiculous. So to poke fun at you, I'm going to use a haha reaction, right? Which is actually quite interesting as well, the kind of very complex assumptions that you find behind very simple reactions and the ambiguity of these reactions. Haha being the most ambiguous of all, sometimes being used to laugh with someone. So create this perhaps nothing more cohesive and that creates social bonds that laughing with someone, right? But then the exact contrary, laughing at someone, right? Trolling someone. So is a reaction that is often used for trolling purposes, where you disagree with someone's posts or ideas. And then obviously likes, retweets on Twitter and loves on Twitter, I mean, and all these other reactions on all these social media platforms or TikTok. I mean, no social media platform doesn't have these. I mean, they've become integrated across all of these platforms. And actually, if anything, they are the thing that is the most recurring and familiar across all these platforms. People immediately know when they are on a social media platform of any kind that they are supposed to like it or not like it, right? They are supposed to react to it. Now, my point there is that ultimately these reactions are not just reactions in the kind of immediate sense of expressing individually what you think, but their entire point is their collective character. Right? They are not just a message you are giving to the person. The way they matter is the way they are summed up with other reactions, the way they become aggregated in a quantitative count of reactions, right? Which is what you see online, right? Where it makes a huge difference actually to the very content of the message, to the very way in which it is understood and interpreted, and in turn reacted to, how many likes, for example, that post has. If you see the kind of unlucky friend who expressed a very complex thought that perhaps was worth pondering, but only got one reaction by her mother, or and then an influencer that has whatever 10,000 likes to a post that perhaps was quite vulgar and stupid, but still, perhaps because of the visibility of the person, got so much attention, it immediately kind of assigns to the latter, the one that got many reactions, a higher value than the former, the one they only got one reaction. And actually, it's not just a matter of visual impression, the effect of seeing that number on the screen, which in turn, as web psychologists have demonstrated, tends to make people more likely to in turn add another reaction because of a bandwagon effect, right? which is the typical instinct we humans have when we see two restaurants and there's a big queue in front of one and no one in the second, we immediately we go in the queue. The same happens with online interactions. Besides that, also algorithmically, the fact that people are en masse liking a certain content or retweeting a certain content creates this rich get richer effect, right? Where something that managed to hit a certain critical mass threshold then is only likely to gather yet more attention, right? So in a way, one could look at our online interactions or our online reactions as a constant referendum, a referendum that happens any second, any minute, or better, any second, where we are basically asked, is this content worth viewing or worth reading? Yes or no? And by pushing the like button or retweeting it, we are basically endorsing it, which is the famous, I mean, you know the famous disclaimer on Twitter, retweets are not endorsements. But if that disclaimer is made, it is precisely because normally retweets are understood as endorsements, because they in fact are, practically and functionally, in a sense that they contribute to the circulation of a given content. So it is like voting in favor, but not just voting in a way that then goes on to carry consequences further down the road, but immediately in the sense that it feeds into the algorithmic visibility of that content. So, and here I'm coming to a conclusion finally. So actually, curiously, React is the name of the very coding platform of Facebook. So this idea of reaction is very much built in the way this platform operates. But I mean, on a conclusion, that if we follow this path going from the utopian of these amorphous communities, styled after the assembly of ancient Athens or town hall democracy in New England, and we go through this more factional democracy, party democracy, and down this path of kind of privatized democracy, we can see that the process of progressive degradation, say, of the project of digital democracy is quite apparent. To this adds the obvious fact that these platforms of really existing digital democracy are private, right? They are for-profit corporations. So to go back to a quote that I cited at the beginning, as part of his bid to buy Twitter, Elon Musk has said that he wants to liberate free speech and that he very much values, as if he were just an ordinary Twitter user, the way in which Twitter has become a town hall, or was a town hall, before becoming the victim of censorship and of the woke left, whatever, a constant insistence to censor people, not allowing people to express themselves, like this discourse that has been developed in recent years. The big difference is that town squares, as we know them from our Mediterranean experience, are quintessentially public, right? Nobody really controls them, right? And these are places where unexpected things can happen, right? And when spontaneous things do happen in the institutional space of the square. To the contrary, places like Facebook, Twitter, and others are very, very private. They actually are the property of some of the biggest corporations on the planet. Corporations that are guided by the profit motive, but also corporations that increasingly appear to be guided also by political motives, right? Which I think is the way we need to interpret the extremely risky operation by someone like Elon Musk, using his own personal capital in the largest purchase by any single individual on the planet of a platform like Twitter that has not been profitable for a long time, that people don't know how it can become profitable, and that will raise all sorts of political and social concerns for him in terms of regulation, in terms of pushback by the European Union, in terms of advertisers, in terms of workers that he wants to lay off, right? I think the reason why someone like Musk wants to control Twitter is not that dissimilar from the reason someone like Jeff Bezos wants to control the Washington Post. It is not an operation that is informed by commercial considerations, but is equally informed by the desire to control the platform where these days public opinion and consensus is constructed, is produced, and is measured by means of likes, by means of retweets and other metrics. So the question to conclude is how some elements of the discourse of digital democracy can be reclaimed and can be liberated from this very sorry process of progressive degradation. There are all sorts of practical issues in doing that. And some of the attempts developed so far to develop alternative platforms in the so-called Web 3.0 or the decentralized web have miserably failed. But I think as platforms like Twitter become ever more controlled by the very top individuals of our economic oligarchy, because that's the actual real name for that, we need really to reflect on what possible alternatives, spaces for digital democracy we should develop and find. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paolo, for your lecture. You talk about very important issues, key issues for our democracies, for the future of our democracy in the web society. Do my colleagues, the students, have any question for Paolo?
Also, some reactions will be okay.
Or some reaction, of course.
Given that we are in the democracy of reactions.
Oh, Gabriela, do you see the raised hands?
There is a reaction.
Okay, yeah. We have Marco Luca, Prodanovic, and Mirjana Nekak.
Maybe Srđan and Mirjana can start. I can ask the question.
Perfect.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yeah,
great. Thanks for a really wonderful lecture. I truly enjoyed it. I referred just for the last part when you talk about the nitty-gritty reality of the whole thing, and about the situation of social media and the way in which we conduct on daily basis this kind of digital democracy. What I found interesting was that statistic that 95% are reactions, but I think that also the other 5%, the fact that people have become, authors, is really significant. There is, especially when you have sort of the analogy with the fact how a couple centuries ago, when books became more affordable, you had pretty much the similar situation. Mm-hmm. People were really opposed of the fact, and that this is before the French Revolution. When you read the history of everyday life, you find the same kind of arguments. This is chaos. Everybody can now have an opinion. This is totally, like dangerous stuff. And you had a thorough after the fact that people became readers, learned how to read, they reacted to crisis in a way in which they envisioned another radically new way of conducting politics. that was, like unforeseen previously. And I think that the same analogy perhaps can be drawn in this situation. So we have reactions, and they can be co-opted by algorithms and economy of attention and all that stuff. But on the other hand, what we have here is this democratainment aspect of it, where we are becoming authors. And the very fact, the psychological fact that we are authors has some kind of political significance.
Yep.
And I think that the other 5%, even if, and also what it means to create a content, if I share a link and have a ironic comment on it, is that a content or a reaction? So yeah, it's just like the other side of the coin is also, I think, really important, and I think also quite often overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy it thoroughly.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with you on that. So in a way, I sympathize a lot with a kind of more populist, in a kind of positive sense, argument that there's been a huge element of democratization in the fact that now people are writing in public, which I think is something quite unprecedented in human history, if you think about it. I mean, ordinary people writing in public. Because already for people to speak in public, for people who are not very literate, especially, was something quite unique, especially mostly happening in small groups or small meetings. Now the fact that people are actually writing in the public square where everyone can see them, and sometimes doing that in broken language, like with spelling mistakes, is something quite beautiful and potentially also very constructive, because also people learn by writing, by making mistakes. At the same time, so in a way, say my ethical standpoint and philosophical standpoint vis-a-vis that has been, on the one hand, to celebrate these always, but at the same time also to remind people of how much of the democracy and of the reality of internet society and of internet democracy is much less lofty than what they imagined, right? Is much more vulgar, right? Much more trivial. But in a way, that has always been the case of mass democracy. There's always been the case of, yeah, I wanted to close on this. There is fundamentally an asymmetry. There is a fundamental social asymmetry, which I think applies in a way, if you want to understand society in general, you need to cope with asymmetry. The fact that there is always an imbalance of some kind, you know? Like the famous Pareto law, the 20-80 distribution, but it applies to so many levels. Like, you know, like in a way, there is always a huge imbalance between, especially between a subject and the object, right? Between the subject and the surrounding environment. We can do so little, right? Compared to to the inertia and to the lack of control over what surrounds us. And that contrasts with the fact that instead utopian thinking is always symmetrical, right? It has always this idea of perfect symmetry. Its favorite geometric image is the circle or the sphere, right? Where everything is equidistant, where everyone has the same power, where everyone is in the same position, right? So it is in a way this tension, which I think needs to be carefully worked out.
Iriana?
Thank you. I will try to turn on the video today. I hope I won't freeze. Thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. I have a question. When we talk about the public sphere, actually the square we are talking about in the internet, which is a Habermasian idea of the public sphere, basically. Faulty as it is, as that idea is, how do we observe the echo chamber? Because we do have the especially now the internet, with all the algorithms that push the content that we actually seek on the internet. So we are more and more separated to the echo chambers, which is contradictory to the democracy, because to have an informed decision, you have to know.
I cannot hear you anymore.
It did freeze, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe we can.
Yeah, I think the question maybe was understandable. How
Yeah, it was understandable. Yes, so perhaps
Yeah.
I'll start answering to that.
Yeah, because she warned us of the freezing coming.
Yeah, no, I think that is very interesting, very important. In fact, that there's been a kind of long-standing debate, right, on digital politics. Indeed, there are some algorithmic tendencies of creating kind of focal points and kind of fragmenting communities and polarizing communities. But my question is this really new? And is this only algorithmic? Because if you think about it, in a way, kind of filter bubbles or echo chambers have always existed throughout human society without the need for algorithmic structures to facilitate them. I mean, think about whatever European society in the 18th century, with noblemen speaking French, whatever, reading philosophy, and peasants, whatever, speaking a local dialect. And sometimes many local dialects that people wouldn't understand 50 kilometers apart, right? Weren't those huge filter bubbles or echo chambers? And isn't this tendency, in a way, of division something that is also more embedded in social organization and social tendencies writ large? What I think the problem rather is, then indeed what you can have is a tendency towards extreme homophily, as it is called. But again, this is something that has been represented in sociology for a long time, is the reason why academics marry academics and artists marry artists, and society becomes all more of the same, right? Is the famous elective affinities that Bourdieu speaks about. But from a political perspective, indeed, that is dangerous, as it is kind of socially more generally, as people start lacking means to understand other people, how other people feel, other life forms beyond their very specific ones. To me, the kind of major divide, I think here Gramsci can, and as an Italian, I need to at some point to quote Gramsci, otherwise I won't do my job. But at some point in the Prison Notebooks, he has some very interesting observation precisely about these, which speaks very much to these, which is in a moment of crisis of authority. Typically what happens is that you have a disjunction between two levels of philosophy, so to speak, of the world of ideas, the intellectuals and the people. And you have that not just in politics, also in religious phenomena. Like when there is a huge kind of religious upheaval, right? What you tend to have, the risk, the ever-present risk, is that the intellectual discourse becomes disjoined from the popular discourse or from popular beliefs. Like actually, the Catholic Church has been constantly struggling to deal with this issue. And basically, Jesuitism for Gramsci was a way to do that, right? To basically combine a more kind of rationalistic and intellectual standpoint with an acceptance in a way that you also needed to create popular consensus, popular adherence to certain beliefs, that you had basically to have an active propaganda to do that. So to me, sorry for the detour, but I think this is in a way the key issue. That, for example, when you have debates on Twitter, for example, that tend to be more elite and where people assume that everyone is a journalist or that everyone is an academic, and then you have debates on Facebook where whatever, assumptions there are often quite different. And the risk that I see is these delinking, right? These breaking of the linkage between intellectual discourse and a more popular discourse online.
Thank you. I agree. I totally agree with you. Marco Luca.
Thank you. Well, I was sort of wondering to maybe pick your brain further about the possibilities of what would be the sort of strategies or tactics for moving forward with this. So, for instance, when it comes to sort of, do you believe that in a sense these, for instance, the centrifugal nature of digital deliberations, for instance, we can imagine maybe, or do you agree that we can imagine that when we have these sort of digital platforms, which are, for instance, when you were talking about Podemos and these sort of very task specific, specific, in which people know we are now entering the digital platform to do this, to make these decisions, to deliberate. Do you believe that these can be designed better as to avoid the pitfalls that they have been having? For instance, from what I see, sort of both policy and in general developments in Taiwan appear to indicate that there are sort of some design decisions which can make deliberation in these digital environments more successful and a bit more, at least more, not necessarily super successful, but quite successful and comparatively more so. And on the other hand, can you imagine such things sort of translated into these sort of digital democracy writ large, deliberations in the wild, or however we want to call it, in terms of perhaps sort of some types of regulation of algorithms, which would at least work negatively to prevent certain dynamics such as bandwagoning and sort of extreme homophily and things like that. I mean,
yes, this is very interesting, Marco Luca. So on the one hand, I think that the very interesting things in recent years has been the extraordinary kind of technological development you've seen at this level. There is all this field of civic tech, which is a burgeoning field. It's not just about digital democracy specifically, it is also about other things, but it has been exploding. It has also become commercially, actually, an important industry, especially in the US, for campaigning, mobilization, but also now kind of for consultation. And you have reached a level of sophistication in the way in which certain platform operates, such as like the Consul one used by Podemos for discussion, which is, it shows just the incredible potential you have there, right? To imagine ways in which you can combine the element of, ultimately, two elements that are in competition or in contradiction, obviously, when it comes to a decision, which is on the one hand, the element of proposal making, drafting, and the element of actual kind of decision, of actual voting on that, right? And how you can make it in a way more sophisticated than being given two proposals and deciding on one of the two, but with elements, for example, of open text, where people can initially make some proposals, and then these are shortlisted. There is, for example, semantic polling, which is a quite interesting field of development. So, I mean, from a technical perspective, I think that the potential is huge, and we have already seen some developments, and we will see more. There are also kind of sophisticated and complex debates about thresholds to avoid the centrifugal tendency of online discussions. So how do you ensure that there is a kind of decent balance between plurality? So ideally, as many people as possible proposing as many ideas as possible, but on the other hand, the limits of our attention and our cognitive ability as Homo sapiens sapiens and not Homo sapiens sapiens sapiens. So on that level, there's loads, and I'm sure that we will see more of that. On the other hand, though, we should also be kind of be aware of the risks of technological solutionism, and the fact that the real limit now is more institutional and organizational. Both a limit of practice and a limit of imagination, right? In sense, how to think of processes, rituals, structures, giving names to things as well, kind of making up new names for things that people do together, which would involve an element of technology, but wouldn't be reducible to that, if you see what I mean. And also involving the fact that, I mean, I think usually the successful forms of digital democracy are the ones where there is an element of conflict, not in the kind of the sorry sense of military conflict, but in the sense, you know, of clash between different interests and different views, right? Where there is a competition going on, because that's what activates people's motivation to participate, right? If it's let's more or less make everyone happy, that, and unfortunately there is a way in which much digital democracy was framed, you know, in this Habermasian kind of view. Instead, what really gets people started and motivated and excited is, wow, I mean, I think about this, but I know many other people think the opposite. So I want my cause to win. Yeah. But to activate that, you need, in a way, to develop organizations, to develop parties using that, yeah, and to make a bit of an effort of imagination in terms of how you deploy these technologies in very specific contexts.
Thank you.
Maybe I can ask a question. In your opinion, why the most important, or maybe also successful digital parties develop in the south of Europe? Is there a more Rousseauian culture, or this is maybe related to the culture of open space, open square you mentioned, or are there other reasons?
I think, yeah, probably the main motivation is political. So, you know, political opportunities. In a sense, these were the countries that were most sacrificed during the Great Recession. And I mean, many economists, especially US economists that have the kind of privilege of distance, have said how crazy austerity policies were, how self-defeating, right? They were kind of self-imposed punishment, which was very much meted on countries in the south of Europe.
Okay. But why not in Greece?
Yeah, that's curious. Yeah, that's, how would you say, it's sometimes a kind of the really is rational, but only in certain circumstances. Yeah, that's, no, so sometimes it is just a matter of a kind of combination of fortuitous factors, and which are not just structural but also ideological. For example, the fact that, you know, in Italy, at some point, this pirate party thing was very fashionable for whatever reason, partly because of Casaleggio's own kind of cultural influences. And they were very much looking at that. They were looking at it as a kind of utopian front. They actually had kind of the participation of some of these people at their conferences. In Spain, there is a very thriving hacker culture. Actually, people often overlook how technologically savvy Spain has become. Is one of the most places where most kind of digital patents are produced in Europe these days. So you see, I mean, it very much derives from circumstances. Also, also in France, you've seen some similar tendencies. Yeah. I don't know if it's down to kind of like more Rousseauian culture in or culture of the public square in European in Southern European countries. That may be the case as well. I think I need more time to figure it out.
Or maybe in UK we have a more Lockean, a more liberal culture, maybe. Or in the north of Europe, there is a more liberal culture, maybe.
Yeah, that may be the case. I mean, obviously, once you kind of witness the system in the US and in the UK, you understand that they are, and you compare it with the one in continental Europe, you understand that it is not just a different degree, it's a different kind, really. You know, like some of the logic behind that is not just the simple mechanism of first past the post. It's something reformable. I mean, to reform it, we need to reform the entire constitution, as it were, and to radically change the entire society, because it is premised on a different understanding of ultimately the nature of authority, really, right? The nature of authority and its relationship with the territory, the basic unit of organization. And that is why, in a way, what is fascinating also about digital democracy is that it unlocks a reflection more generally about democracy, the hidden premises, including kind of mathematical premises of democracy writ large. You know, like that's something that at first sight may look banal, taken for granted, obvious, such as elections. In fact, hinges on extremely arbitrary and profoundly ideological assumptions about what the popular will is, right? How you count it, in which way, through which mathematical, I mean, there are algorithms themselves, like that DONT method, for example, right? So in a way, one could say that democracy has always been digital, so to speak, right? It says it, or at least quantitative, has always involved some algorithms, some mechanisms to establish what constitutes a legitimate decision that are now naturalized. But as soon as you lift the hood of democracy and you look into that, or if you look at Italy, where we have changed electoral law every 2 years, or every kind of like not to exaggerate, every 5 years, right? You see just how much that is open to question and dispute.
Thank you very much for your very clever answer. I don't know, maybe if I don't know if there are other questions. I think that maybe if there are no other questions, we may close our conversation with Paolo. The lecture and also the debate have been very rich, and I would like to thank, of course, Paolo Gerbaudo for the interesting talk, and everybody for the participation. Now let's take a short break, and we will start the next talk at 11:15, I think. Am I right, Marco Luca?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect.
Nice.
So thank you very much, and see you later.
Thanks very much.
Grazie, Paolo.
Take care.